Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. It's really a very great honor to have the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, here today to speak with us about her vision for women with regards to closing the gender gap, a gap that we obviously still very much experience. I should also say it is a remarkable testament to the president that she has filled up the forum on the loveliest Friday we've had in a long time, on Friday afternoon. Trust me, no one else could do this. So it's truly amazing. But it should not be a surprise, and I'm not doing the introduction of the president here. She left office very recently with an 80% approval rating. Now, few presidents ever see a single day in their lives of an 80% approval rating, no matter what they've done, and very, very few heads of state in this economy, having gone through this period, have anything other than very, very tepid support. So I am just thrilled to have you here, and it's a great honor. And she's thrilled too, or he's thrilled. I shouldn't presume she, I suppose. I want to also thank various folks, the Institute of Politics, Women's Institute of Leadership for being a part of this, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and finally, very importantly, the Harvard Kennedy School Women in Public Policy Program. They all helped sponsor this event and contribute to it. And I'm especially delighted to have the Women's Leadership Board here. They are really key supporters of the school and of the Women in Public Policy Program. They individually and collectively represent an enormously important and very positive force advancing issues of gender, not only here at the school, but ultimately across the world. So let me just briefly introduce our moderator for today, and that's Iris Bonet. She really needs very little introduction for most of you. She is a professor of public policy here at the school, and she's the director of the Harvard Kennedy School Women in Public Policy Program. She's also the associate director of something called the Harvard Decision Sciences Laboratory, vice chair of the program negotiation, and she is the chair of our special program for young global leaders selected by Davos, the World Economic Forum, that she does a spectacular job for every year. There's many, many other things that I could go on and talk to her about, but I guess the simplest way I can prove how remarkable I think she is I asked her to become the academic dean. That's the sort of number 2 person, really the number 1 person, but I try and pretend. And she accepted. So other than the fact that she accepted, there's much impressive suggestion there. So she too has an 80% approval rating around here. And so without further ado, let me introduce Iris Bonet.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. It is an honor, an enormous honor for me to introduce to you one of my personal heroes, or heroines, I should say, role models for so many of you here in the audience, President Michelle Bachelet. On behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Public Policy Program and the Women's Leadership Board, I would like to welcome you all here this afternoon. In particular, I'd like to welcome my colleague Victoria Butson, who is the Executive Director of the Women in Public Policy Program, and Barbara Annis, the Chair of the Women's Leadership Board, and really all of you, small or tall or large, the many families that we have here tonight, this afternoon. It's just so wonderful to see you. Michelle Bachelet, as you know, joins us here in her new role as the first Undersecretary General for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women at the UN, and the Executive Director for UN Women, which was established on July 2nd this year. Before joining the UN, Mrs. Bachelet was the President of Chile from 2006 to 2010. She's a longtime champion of gender equality and women's rights, and she has advocated in that role in many different capacities. One of her major successes as president was her decision to save billions of dollars to spend on pension reform, which guaranteed a program of social protection for women and children, despite the financial crisis. This included tripling the number of free early childcare centers for low-income families and the completion of about 3,500 childcare centers around the country. President Bachelet also held ministerial portfolios in the Chilean government as Minister of Defense and Minister of Health. As Defense Minister, she introduced gender policies intended to improve the condition of women in the military and the police forces. As Minister of Health, she implemented healthcare reform, improving attention to primary care facilities with the aim of ensuring better and faster healthcare response for families. President Bachelet herself has 3 children and speaks Spanish, English, French, German, and Portuguese. All around, she is just an incredible woman, and we are so incredibly honored to have you here this afternoon. President Bachelet, thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you, Dean. When you hear me speak English, you said she doesn't even speak English, but it's okay. I'll do my best. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm glad to have, again, this opportunity. I came here as president to share some thoughts now on my new capacity as executive director of UN Women. That's the short name for a very long name, a little bit breathtaking, that is new entity, a UN entity for gender equality and women's empowerment, and then you cannot breathe anymore. So everybody's saying UN Women. And some of the few men, because gender parity is not inside UN Women yet, said that the other way of saying is UN we men. So that's the way of trying to involve and be inclusive. Well, but really I want to share with you some thoughts on the opportunities and challenges, a lot of challenges, for gender equality and women's rights, and the way in which UN Women will address these issues. Let me start by saying that I think this is an exciting time for women. I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but there are also opportunities. And UN Women, which brings together 4 smaller agencies that were working for so many years in different areas, it brings together into a stronger and better resource, well, not that better resource, but a little bit better resource. The rest I have to fundraise it. Is one of the reasons, I mean, to try to have a bigger and stronger, if I would say, entity. Particularly because I think its creation signals a recognition that achieving gender equality and women's rights is regarded as on par with other pressing global issues, including ending poverty and hunger, reducing maternal mortality, or combating climate change, to mention some of the very important issues. So it is a huge step forward, and it indicates that member states of the United Nations realize that they need to do more to accelerate progress on gender equality and on all of the agreed development goals. They have given us the authority and mandate to lead the UN system in supporting countries to deliver on gender equality commitments, and have urged us to work across the UN system to make this happen. A key tenet for UN Women is that gender equality and women's empowerment are goals in their own right, and also central to all other goals, and must become a lived reality in all countries. And as you probably have heard, that during last year's September General Assembly Summit on MDGs, it was clear to say that the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal number 3, empowerment of women, was important by itself, but it was also key in terms of being able, the countries, to achieve all the rest of the Millennium and Development Goals. And there are some indications that we're moving in the direction of some progress. Today, 132 countries have laws against domestic violence, and 115 guarantee women equal property rights. Women's access to primary education is equal to that of men in almost all countries, with improvements in secondary education occurring steadily, if slowly. Women's labor force participation has also increased steadily in all regions, although the quality of the employment options has not. Women's political representations has also increased, even though I will believe this is the slowest progress of all. Women's share of seats in parliament averaged over 19% worldwide. 19, 1-9, not 90, huh? And while that still represents 5 men for every woman, some countries have done much better. It's between 26 and 28 countries that have reached what Beijing Platform of Action mentioned to be the critical mass needed in parliament in terms that legislation will really represent the needs and concerns of women. And it's 30%, only 26 or 28, because it changed when there are elections sometimes. This changes a little bit, has reached this. The critical mass needed to advance gender equality priorities. And several have reached the 40 and almost 60%. Rwanda is the country with the highest level of female representation in parliament. It has 54%. South Africa has 44%. But in all of them, I mean, for all those 28, 23 needed what you would call affirmative action, quota laws or other kind of mechanism. It's difficult, that is like a natural process. It needs to be really intended to. Even more hopeful is what the statistics don't show, namely that women increasingly look at political and economic participation as a right. This is particularly clear in the Arab states region, where women who once stay out of the public arena are now, we have all seen it, standing side by side with men to demand freedom and dignity and the right to participate in the reshaping and the revitalizing of their societies. At the same time, however, the limited representation of women in institutions of democratic transition, at least so far, shows that change is not automatic. We understand that it will take years of advocacy and negotiation, courage and determination. To make change happen, we need to understand where gaps are narrowing and where they're not. What we have learned over the 10 years of effort to achieve the Millennium Development Goals is that these gaps are not narrowing in the same pace, and for some groups of women are actually widening. In some cases, the gaps between different groups of women and girls, based on income level, social identity, and where they live, are larger than those based on gender. That is why I have called these remarks closing equality gaps, not just gender gaps. These trends, in part, reflect the global context in which we find ourselves. The huge gaps in wealth and income that have accompanied global growth have deepened with the economic crisis and pushed millions of workers, especially women, into permanent informal employment. Both political conflict and natural disasters are driving up fuel and food prices, threatening livelihoods and food security in many countries and straining household coping strategies. Taking into account persistent gender inequalities in many areas, both in developed and developing countries, we identify 5 thematic priorities where you and women will work. Well, the main word will be empowerment. I do believe that if women are not empowered, we'll never have equal rights. So we are focusing a lot, and I do also believe that if women don't have, in some ways, some economic autonomy, it's very difficult to have gender and real rights. So that's why women's economic empowerment will be one of our main priorities. The second will be, I would say, is women political participation and leadership. We need to enhance women's voices, participation and leadership. Of course, we continue dealing with ending violence against women. And fourth, I would say, women's full engagement in peace and in conflict, and particularly post-conflict recovery. And also a fifth priority is to help build national capacity in terms of national development planning, budgeting, and something that sometimes in some parts of the world is very necessary is how we help them to collect and organize data desegregated by gender, because otherwise we cannot measure progress. While all of these are close, but you could ask yourself, why is she not mentioning health or education? She's a doctor. Doesn't she care about maternal mortality? I do care. But the thing is that when I identify these priorities, we have done it understanding what the woman's needs, consultation with a lot of people, but also understanding, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, is that the rest of the system has to continue doing what they have to do. So WHO, UNAIDS, UNFPA will continue working on health because they are the ones who are providing, they are the leading ones. Education, UNESCO is the leading one, but we are going to work on all these areas, building partnership with them. So all of these areas are really closely related, but I will focus today on women's economic empowerment, an area which is attracting growing interest across the United Nations, the private sector, and the international financial institutions. The World Bank, its next report is called Gender Women in Business. It means smart economics. The IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, is including a gender equality component, and in every credit that will give to the countries, there will be the requirement of incorporating gender perspective and in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment. And as I mentioned, the World Bank and others have shown that women's increased labor force participation and earnings generate economic growth and have a multiplier effect on society as a whole, particularly in terms of education and health outcomes. Equally importantly, we know that women who earn their own income can challenge the way decisions are made in households, demand the right to engage in the political arena, and claim the right to be safe from violence. Reducing poverty is not only about numbers, it's essentially about people, and that poverty reduction ultimately means empowering people economically. UN Women intends to work with partners to support women's economic autonomy, including opportunities for decent work and asset building, basic social protection, and the extension of labor protection to informal workers. In all of this, we will work closely with women's groups at different levels, academic, professional, but also grassroots organization. And this approach was highlighted as critical in almost all the consultations that UN Women has had with women's rights networks. It also accords with the findings of numerous reports prepared for last year's MDG Summit, as I already mentioned, including those by UN Women, UNICEF, and the UN MDG Office. All of this found that poor and rural women and girls, especially those from ethnic minorities or indigenous groups who are especially reliant on public services, are often left behind. In developing countries, for example, the wealthiest women are 3 times more likely than the poorest to receive professional care during childbirth, and rural children are twice as likely to be out of school as urban children. But the real obstacle is poverty. Girls in the poorest 20% of households are more than 3 times more likely to be out of school than those in the richest households, and 4 times more likely to be out of schools as boys in those households. The same is true in secondary education, where even though the global gender gap is closing, some groups of girls are being left behind, particularly in rural areas. And these findings point to the need to ensure that efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goals do not neglect the need to focus on disparities within groups. Because sometimes percentage looks fine, but when you look a little bit more deeper, you can find those incredible disparities. And that speaks why UN Women is necessary, because you cannot have global policies affecting groups that are not behaving, if I may say, in the same way, because there are disparities inside how the groups behave, if I can use that word. Looking at under 5 mortality, for example, UNICEF found that in many developing countries which have succeeded in reducing the rate of under 5 child mortality over the last 10 years, the disparity between rich and poor children's survival has actually increased by as much as 10% in some countries. This underlines the need to find ways to enable more women to share in economic and social progress in all countries. UN Women place emphasis on women and girls excluded from such gains, including poor women, indigenous and rural women, HIV, women living with HIV or AIDS, women with disabilities, and women informal and migrant workers. And next week, I'm attending a UN conference on least developed countries, where 72% of the population live in rural areas, and nearly 80% live on less than $2 a day. At this conference, I intend to emphasize the need to empower rural women, including women agricultural workers, improving their access to land and productive inputs to guarantee household food security, especially for the poorest households. Empowering women economically is particularly urgent in post-conflict situations, where poverty is chronic, owing to the destruction of infrastructure and also of the productive assets and the fabric of community and social life. Some of you may have heard me saying, but of course you have read probably many times, that during the first UN General Assembly in 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt insisted that women should have the opportunity to, and I will quote her, share in the work of peace and reconstruction as they did in war and resistance. End of journey. But what we look at, the peace and security agenda, and Ambassador Swanee Hunt is around, that she has worked a lot on that, we see that this work still carried out mostly by men. But the need to empower women economically is not only true in the least developed and fragile states. The reality is that widening gaps among women and men and children are happening at a time when the distribution of poverty is changing. A recent study shows that unlike 20 years ago, when over 90% of the world's poor were concentrated in low-income countries, today 3/4 of people in poverty are located in middle-income countries. Of course, the main reason for this shift is probably the fact that the countries that have moved into the middle-income category are those with very large populations, such as India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Nigeria. However, the shift also serves to underline the fact that along with economic growth in this country has come widening income gaps, pushing those at the bottom into chronic poverty. One way to do this is through a social protection floor, part of the 6-point strategy to respond to the economic crisis adopted by the UN Chief Executive Board. And that's my other hat, because I'm the chair of the advisory board on social protection floor, and we're going to launch our report in September this year, and we're pushing the G20. So if for the first time, it can be not only about monetary and financial issue, but also a little bit about people and social protection. I hope we succeed on this. Well, this is intended, as I mentioned, social protection floor intends to provide basic income security, such as pension for the elderly and person with disabilities, child benefits, income support benefits, and employment guarantees, as well as access to essential public services, including, of course, healthcare, primary education, housing, water, and sanitation. And it's called floor because it means you start with the basic that you have and you continue progressing. Elements of the social protection floor already are in place in many countries, including low-income countries, have shown to be effective ways to combat rising inequality and persistent poverty. And I have to tell you that after the financial and economical crisis, countries who did have a protection floor could avoid social collapse and really came out very faster from the crisis. Moreover, it's important to acknowledge social protection as an investment, not as a cost. Because it's not only about protection. We call it social protection floor, but it is about preventing, protecting, but particularly empowering people and giving them better conditions so they can look for a better job. They are more qualified people with better health, better education, and so on. It delivers significant future paybacks in terms of improved human development outcomes and is seen as a key instrument to unlock women's productive capacity, enabling them to more fully participate in economic life as workers, employers, consumers, and citizens. Economic autonomy also enables women to take on public and political leadership roles, which is vital to a future which puts gender equality at the center of economic and social progress. And having an independent income empowers women to challenge household power relations and demand the right to live free of violence. In conclusion, let me emphasize that strengthening women's economic autonomy is essential to everything else. And in Chile, during my presidency, we introduced job training programs, particularly for women heads of household, subsidies to employers to encourage them to hire women, but also young people, I have to say, not only for women, and the promulgation of an equal pay law. In the first year of my administration, we put in place a code of good labor practices for the public administration, which set guidelines for ensuring gender equality. And we also work with the private sector so they could, I would say not mandatory, of course, be part of this effort. And many, many companies did sign the same code. And we're now working in UN Women with the Global Compact and the corporate sector in introducing what is called women's equality means business. It's a lot of principles that more than 150 CEOs have signed that could bring women from giving more capacities, more access to opportunities, and also to have more CEOs, more gender parity at the senior top managerial levels, but also a struggle against harassment at the workplace. Well, and recognizing the role of women's time burdens in determining their life choices, my government provided an extensive network of free education and childcare centers that Iris mentioned, especially for poor households, so that women could work or seek work in the full knowledge that their children were well cared for. In all of these ways, we sought to close the equality gaps, but perhaps most important was social security, which ensured low-income men and women a dignified and financially secure old age. And among the greatest beneficiaries were women. Towards the end of 2009, 65% of the pensions went to women, not only to pay those in paid employment, but also to those who work at home and never receive wages, because that's a work that never receive acknowledged, and it's a lot of work. So we thought it was very important. But it's also a way of saying children is the responsibility of the whole society. So we need to, to also produce, no, the word compensation doesn't sound good, but sort of a stimulus or incentive. So children will be really felt as a whole, as a responsibility of men and women. Well, today, as far as money is concerned, many of these women who had pension, particularly households, will have something to show for the hard work that they have done throughout their lives. So for me, it's having been President of the Republic, having been to deal with concrete policies and decisions, because it was a matter of justice, because it's a matter of equality, I think gives me a good experience in terms of how to deal with the very challenging situation we have in front of us. And we have defined these 5 thematic priorities, but understanding that it has to be a decision of the countries, and our work is to work with the countries, with the government, with the national partners, government, civil society, women's organization, in terms of finding in each country, because it's very different, the reality from one region to another, and sometimes from one country to another, and as I said, inside the country, some groups with other groups, in terms of finding the best strategies, the best policies, to strengthen the national women machineries, but also to strengthen our capacity to work transversally with the whole government. Because as I said, our champion should be the Minister of Finance, because we need them to be convinced that to spend money on women is the best investment they can do. So we have a lot of challenges. It's not an easy task, many of these challenges need cultural changes, and cultural changes, you won't achieve it in a day or two, or 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. But I'm so convinced there are so many men and women, like the ones who are here today, who understand, are struggling for gender equality, understanding that is essential in terms to have a better world for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for your insightful remarks. We have 4 microphones, and if you would like to ask a question, please identify yourself, tell us who you are and which program you are, and then pose your question. We'll start right here.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. My name is Jaime Besa. I'm a student here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm from Chile. We all know that you're very passionate about this issue. In fact, when you were president, you took very concrete actions. One of them was to have a 50% gender quota in your first cabinet. My question to you is, what were the reasons that led you to take the decision? But most importantly, what other reasons led you not to follow that quota in your subsequent cabinets? Thank you.
Well, I have to tell you that we did have gender equality, parity all over the government, but not necessarily in every place, because for me, gender parity was, the reason is that women in the world are invisible. You have wonderful women everywhere, but usually people don't see it. They don't see their needs, their concerns, and particularly their capacities and talents and merits. So, and this was something that I could have from my own experience, and we were talking to some people. Usually women, when they're professional, they have to feel like 3 times better to be perceived as a good one. They have to be always showing that they're great and they have great ideas. And I thought that we did have great men, but also great women. And also believe that a better democracy is when it's better represented, men and women. Because it's really, when you are born in the shoes of a man, you will never have the same understanding of what women's needs are. You could understand it rationally, but it's different because you have lived a different, you have standing on different shoes, if I may say. So for me, to have a government where really we could really have in our politics the legitimacy, I would say, the best combination, it was women should be there. And second, to visibilize wonderful women. Because I truly believe, and that's probably one of the first reasons, is that in gender equality and women's empowerment, symbols are very important. I would have never been President of the Republic if I haven't been Minister of Defense. Being Minister of Health, it was like a girl thing. Even though I was the first Minister of Health in the history of Chile. But it was like, working for caring, and caring is a womanish. So defense, on the other hand, is more powerful. As Minister of Foreign Affairs, because we were 2 in the primaries, 2 women, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and me. So I always thought that it was very important, the symbolic things to show, look, we have great women. Let's acknowledge this, and let's work in consequence with that. What happens that when you do have to do cabinets, reshuffle cabinet, sometimes you don't find the right person. Could not be a woman, it could be a man. But I did not only introduce gender parity in the cabinet, I had at the level of undersecretaries, vice ministers, governors, because in Chile are not elected directly, are appointed, politically appointed, and everywhere in charge of the treasury of the country. There were great women, I put women. So it was more, even in some places there was one intendente, and the 3 governors were women. There was no parity there. It was men really in a minority. So I had the concept, but what I always did from the beginning, first of all, is to choose the right person, capable, with talent, gifted, with merit, with commitment, and with passion, and then the half was women and half men. Sometimes when I had to make changes, I didn't find a person. I put a man because he was the one who represented, because essentially parity is a concept. It doesn't have to be 50-50. Sometimes it could be 52-48 on one direction or another. But I really had women everywhere, and I think it was good for Chile.
Thank you.
We'll move up there to the balcony.
Hi, my name is Jyoti Jasrasaria, and I'm a junior at the college. I'm also the undergraduate chair of the Women's Initiative and Leadership Program, so thank you so much for being here. My question is, I was just wondering how UN Women works with local groups to design empowerment programs that are sensitive to differences of like culture, region, and geography.
Well, we are not present all over the world. We are only in 78 countries right now, but we try to have a bigger coverage, if I may say, through our regional and sub-regional offices. So, and we are working in the new organization. We will be strengthening our capacities in some country offices, sub-regional and regional offices, but also we'll work with multi-countries approach. So we try to do the most without using so much money in our own capacity, but trying to put more money on women's organization. And in every place, there is a relation with women's organizations of government, but also with civil society, and it is demand-driven. I mean, we don't go there to tell them this is the truth, and you need, no, on the contrary, we discuss with them they were part of the consultations also. I mean, I'm talking from UN Women to the Future. We developed a strategic plan, and because I believe in participation, we implemented consultation in more than 70 countries, because it was in very short time, 2 months, and because I need to submit it in June to the executive board. And there the women came, and there was discussions on what they expected from UN Women, and my priorities reflect pretty much that too, the people's needs. But of course, in every place, there will be specific issues. In some places, for example, I'm convinced that what we need to do is to strengthen the capacity of women living in rural areas and helping them having better livelihoods and helping them producing. So because in some places, they know how to produce good products, but they have problems with water supply or storage supply. So what happens is that then they go to markets, usually in bad roads. The products not always are in good shape when they arrive to the market, and they have no place to store it in well conditions. So if they're going to lose the product, they finish selling in a very low price, so they will never get out of poverty. So we're also going to try to add value to those products. We're also going to try to include technological transfer. And we are talking with the corporate sector that when they have to develop their supply chains in many countries, and many of them their supply chains are in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, they try to have sort of a gender perspective and think on females, SMEs, because that will be a very good thing to help them, and also training and so on. But I will tell you, it's demand-driven. We do not impose. Second thing, I believe that women's rights and women's empowerment is essential, but I do believe that culture, religions, and so on have to be considered as long as tradition, as long as that tradition doesn't mean harmful for the girls. And I will tell you an example. In Ethiopia, our people work with religious leaders, looking at the Quran and realizing that there's no place there, of course, where it says that anything can harm girls. So they are the ones who are championing now against FGM, against female genital mutilation, helping, because the ones who perform it are people at the communities, mothers or women, working with them to say, okay, this is a social norm, but it harms the girl. Let's find another social norm. So we really respect, and I would say we find the ways in every country that according to the tradition, the culture, to advance and in ways that women can improve their lives.
Hello, my name is Janine Jacob. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. This is an unprecedented time in the Middle East. We're starting to see true, perhaps for the first time really, democratic movements where women are playing sort of a nominal role. At the beginning of the movements, women actually were afraid to go to the protests for fear of being groped. And now we're talking about, perhaps having governments where women can participate on a more political level. What is UN Women doing right now specifically to address these issues and to try to increase women's participation in the Middle East?
Well, at the end of March, or in March, I went to Egypt. I had meetings with the women's organization, but also with the young women and girls that were in Tahrir Square. And we had a very interesting meeting because they spoke to me, they told me that they were a little bit concerned because when they were there, they were like side by side and everything was great. But afterwards, when the revolution was already an issue, and they go back to the new parties who are being created, some of the people told them, you know what, girls, it's not your time now. Now we have to consolidate democracy, we have to vote, and so on. And they were very disappointed because they were young, they really believed this is the moment. But on the other hand, they understood that they need not to give up, and they need to continue working and advocating and finding the ways that and strengthen their capacity. And it was the other anecdotic issue that was fantastic is that the so-called the Facebook and Twitter generation, and then they were there in the meeting with the computers and their phones, and while I was saying something, they were sending it everywhere. So as I said, it was sort of an official WikiLeaks, I would say, because everybody was hearing and having information. But what are we doing there? Because we have a UN Women office in Egypt, and we don't have it in Tunisia, but I'll speak a little bit about Tunisia in a minute more. And we have been working with them, what they ask us to do. I mean, some of them have asked to, I gave a lot of suggestions, recommendations from my own experience to them, but our team has continued working with them in terms of strengthening their capacities, their leadership, and with women's work the same. Legal advisors who have been, experts, bringing together experts, and we are going to have pretty soon a national women summit with panels with different women. So they will be discussing on legislation aspects that they want to be reflected afterwards on the new constitution, so they can advance. How much they can advance, we don't know. This is our moments that can have a great success or might be a little bit slower, but we're doing our best. In Morocco we have an office, not in Tunisia. And from Morocco, we have been working also with the Tunisian women. In Morocco, at the beginning, on the 3 commissions they developed, the women had little presence in 2 of them, in the human rights violations and in legislative and legal issues. And they just passed a bill where it will be the Constituent Assembly, when they elected, it should have 50% men, 50% women, and the list should have 1 name female, 1 male, 1 female, 1 male. I think it's incredible progress, and they have done a lot in the past, but so there is progress, it is advancing, and we do what they ask us. For example, in some places it told us, can you help us with comparative information about compare constitutions in terms of women's rights that are all over the world, because they need to choose their regime, what they want it to be. Because some of them come from very presidentialist and very strong president presence, authoritarian. They don't want a presidential system, but they need to understand if the parliamentary system is the one they want, or a mix, and so on. So every time they have asked us on things, we have been giving them support so they can do their job, because something they're very proud of. And I think it's so important is ownership of their own revolution. So we need to support their capacities and what they need, not go there to tell them what they have to do.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name is Evelyn. I'm a student at Harvard Law School. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of reproductive rights in women's development, specifically what UN Women is doing to include reproductive rights in the agenda.
Well, it happens that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, we are not going to replace what the rest of the agencies are doing, because the General Assembly resolutions establish clearly, because what nobody wants is that every RDL said, okay, we have a UN Women, we don't work on women anymore. So there is a special agency who works in that, is the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund. That they are in charge of sexual and reproductive rights, as UNAIDS is in charge of women living with HIV and AIDS. UNDP is women and development. So we are part of a task force trying to push in the same direction, helping and building partnership with them. They are the leading ones. They are the ones who develop. They have their offices at the country field. They are the ones who have the doctors, the nurses, whatever is needed. We only do advocacy and support their efforts.
We have time for one more question, please.
No, actually, my question was about birth control. It's pretty much the same question, because I just finished reading a report on women in African countries and how HIV is rampant and how there isn't sufficient food and water as it is, and that they're expecting tremendous population explosions, and that no one is dealing with birth control for these women. I understand that it's in a separate division, but it's such an important right for these women.
Yeah, but what I want to tell you, when I said that we're not going to do it, is that I'm not going to send doctors there, because the others are doing it. WHO, UNAIDS, UNFPA. And we have a lot of work to do, but that doesn't mean that we are not concerned with that and not involved with that. Particularly, I truly believe when you see at some, and I have to tell you, here in this country, there's a maternal mortality too, and it's some issue you have to address too. And I think that birth control is, I mean, the possibility of women to, I'm a doctor, so I really believe on that. What can I tell you? And I do believe, because when you see where are the highest rates of maternal mortality, is particularly in adolescents between 15 and 18 or 19. So this is a huge issue, and I'm so convinced that there are two things that are indispensable. One is to have access to sexual and reproductive services, with birth control, with sexual education, with all what is needed to do, but also to retain girls at schools. It really permits to not only to give opportunities in life, but also to diminish the risk of HIV/AIDS, of early pregnancy, of early marriage, of everything. So I believe both things has to be done, to retain girls at school as much as possible, and to have systems, even though we're not the ones. I mean, I'm not going to build the place and give the anti-conceptives. But if I go to a place, I speak to the minister, I speak to the president. I went to San Salvador like a month ago. And in the meeting with the ministers, and because I was Minister of Health and I had to deal with these issues, I could not help myself. So I started saying, but what have you thought on this and this? And midwives, and because midwives, doctors are very expensive and sometimes they're not, and they're very good experiences. Indonesia, for example, they trained 54,000 midwives in 7 years, and they halved maternal mortality. So when we're thinking on early pregnancy, that I think you are thinking on that in part, and also on maternal mortality, of course, sexual and reproductive services are essential. But also HIV/AIDS, because we have sort of an alliance with Michel Zidibe. He's the head of UNAIDS, and Professor Babatunde Oshomitemi is in UNFPA. We're the three doctors. So we try to push together. So, for example, women who are living with HIV/AIDS, they can not only seen as mothers and try to avoid vertical transmission and receive IRB during pregnancy, and then not anymore, but on the contrary, to receive all the time, because we want to avoid transmission, but we also want to have women who are living and mothers and so on. So, and one way of doing this is to, because in many places they have sexual and reproductive services here, and care of HIV/AIDS here. And one of the things we are calling for is to bring together all these services. So I can't help myself, even though it's not my mandate, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, because they're sensitives, huh? Here comes these people, and it's a president, maybe she thinks she can do everything and so on. So, but I'm trying to build strong partnership with them. So I think it's a bit more response to your question too.
With that, thank you so much, President Bachelet.
He was really disappointed that I didn't, but it's not my area.
No, thank you so much. I would like to ask you to please remain seated or standing for just a moment. The president has to leave and catch a plane, and so we just want to let her go first. So thank you very much for coming. It has been an enormous pleasure.